Devon checked his phone one more time as he walked through the gates of Sterling Field Airport. 6:30 in the morning, and the place was already buzzing with activity. Private jets lined the tarmac like expensive toys, gleaming white and silver in the early sunlight. He adjusted his backpack and tried to look like he belonged there. This was his first day at Premier Aviation Services, and honestly, he wasn't sure what to expect. When his technical school teacher had told him about the summer internship, Devon thought it was too good to be true. Most kids from his neighborhood in Detroit never got chances like this. But his grades in the aviation program were solid, and somehow his application had made it through. The main hangar was massive, bigger than his high school gymnasium. The smell hit him first: motor oil, metal, and something clean and chemical that he couldn't name. Mechanics in blue uniforms moved around expensive aircraft like they were working on regular cars. Devon stood there for a moment, taking it all in. "You must be the new kid," said a voice behind him. Devon turned to see a man in his 50s with graying hair and oil-stained hands. "I'm Rick, the floor supervisor. You're early." "Yes, sir, I'm Devon Parker." Rick looked him up and down, not unkindly, but Devon could feel the assessment happening. "All right, Devon, let me show you around. Stay close and don't touch anything unless I tell you to." As they walked through the hangar, Devon tried to absorb everything. Rick pointed out different aircraft types, explained the basic workflow, and introduced him to a few mechanics. Most of them nodded politely, but Devon caught the quick glances, the quiet conversations that stopped when he walked by. He'd expected this. He was 17 black and clearly didn't have the years of experience written on his face like the other guys. "We mostly do maintenance and repairs on private aircraft," Rick was saying. "Rich folks who own these birds expect perfection. One tiny mistake and we lose contracts worth millions." They stopped next to a sleek Cessna Citation. Devon ran his eyes over the aircraft, noting the engine type, the landing gear configuration, the antenna placement. His grandfather's old aviation books had taught him to see planes this way, as complex systems that all had to work together perfectly. "Ever worked on jets before?" asked Tony, one of the younger mechanics who'd been listening to Rick's tour. "Not jets exactly," Devon said carefully. "But I've studied them. My grandfather used to—" He stopped himself. These guys probably didn't want to hear about his grandfather's old stories. Studied them where? YouTube? Tony grinned, but there was an edge to it. Technical school. And books. Lots of books. Before Tony could respond, the hangar's main door rolled open with a mechanical rumble. Everyone stopped what they were doing. A black sedan pulled up, followed by a white truck with Sterling Enterprises written on the side in blue letters. "Heads up," Rick muttered. "The big boss is here." Out of the sedan stepped a man in an expensive suit. Even from across the hangar, Devon could tell this was someone important. The way he moved, the way other people suddenly stood straighter. This had to be the CEO Rick had mentioned. Jonathan Sterling, the tech billionaire who owned half the planes they worked on. But it was the truck that caught Devon's attention. Two men in coveralls were unloading equipment, and their faces looked stressed. Behind them, a crew was carefully towing in a large aircraft. Even from a distance, Devon could see it was a Gulfstream G650, one of the most expensive private jets money could buy. "That's Sterling's personal ride," Rick said quietly. "If something's wrong with that bird, it's going to be a long day for all of us." Sterling walked over to where the senior mechanics were gathering. Devon couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the body language. Pointing at the aircraft, shaking heads, frustrated gestures. Whatever was wrong with the Gulfstream, it wasn't a simple fix. "Parker," Rick called, "come on. Let's go see what's happening." They joined the group around the aircraft. Up close, the Gulfstream was even more impressive. The paint job was flawless. The interior visible through the windows looked like something from a luxury hotel. But Devon's attention was drawn to something else. A small panel near the nose that was slightly off color, like it had been recently replaced. Sterling was talking to the lead mechanic, a man named George who'd been working on aircraft since before Devon was born. "The avionics system keeps shutting down randomly," Sterling was saying. "My pilot says all the instruments just go dark for a few seconds, then come back online. It's happened 3 times in the last week." George nodded grimly. "We'll tear into the electrical system, sir. Could be a loose connection. Could be a bad component. These new computerized systems can be tricky." "I need this aircraft ready by tomorrow," Sterling said. I've got a board meeting in Chicago that I cannot miss. We'll do our best, sir. For the next 3 hours, Devin watched the senior mechanics work. They pulled panels, tested circuits, checked connections. The avionics bay was a maze of wires and computer modules, each one more complex than anything Devin had seen in technical school. But as he watched, something nagged at him. The pattern of the shutdowns that Sterling had described, complete electrical failure for a few seconds, then normal operation, reminded him of something. One of his grandfather's old aviation manuals had a whole chapter on electrical problems in older aircraft. The symptoms were similar, but the cause was usually something simple that looked complicated. Could be the main bus tie relay, suggested one mechanic. Already checked it, George replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. Everything tests normal. What about the generator control units? Those too. I'm starting to think we need to call in a specialist from Gulfstream. Devin found himself studying the wiring diagrams posted on the hangar wall. The G650's electrical system was incredibly sophisticated, but the basic principles were the same as any aircraft. Power generation, distribution, control systems, it all had to work together. That's when he saw it. In the diagram, there was a small component called a power sequencer relay. It was designed to prevent electrical surges during startup and shutdown. But if it was starting to fail, it might cause exactly the kind of intermittent problem Sterling was describing. He looked back at the aircraft. The panel that had caught his attention earlier, the slightly off-color one, was right where the power sequencer would be located. Devin hesitated. He was just the intern, the new kid who'd been here less than 4 hours. These were experienced mechanics who'd forgotten more about aircraft than he'd ever learned. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. If you see something that doesn't look right, speak up. Staying quiet never fixed anything. Excuse me, he said, approaching George. I might have an idea about what's causing the problem. The conversation around the aircraft stopped. George looked at him with surprise, then something that might have been annoyance. Kid, we appreciate the enthusiasm, but this is complex work. I know, sir. But I was looking at the symptoms and I think it might be the power sequencer relay. That panel there, he pointed to the discolored section, looks like it's been worked on recently. If the relay is starting to fail, it would cause intermittent shutdowns that look random but actually follow a pattern. Tony snorted. Power sequencer? That's pretty advanced stuff for someone who learned about jets from books. But George was looking at Devin with new interest. What kind of pattern? Devin took a breath. The shutdowns probably happen during high electrical load situations. Gear retraction, flap movement, weather radar activation. The relay can't handle the surge, so it opens the circuit for a few seconds to protect itself, then closes again. There was a moment of silence. Then George looked at the other mechanics. Has anyone actually tested the power sequencer? Heads shook around the group. It's not on the standard troubleshooting checklist for avionics problems, admitted one of the technicians. George walked over to his toolbox and pulled out a multimeter. Well, kid, let's find out if your book learning is worth anything. Sterling, who had been standing nearby making phone calls, walked over to see what was happening. His eyes found Devin, and for a moment their gazes met. Devin saw something there, curiosity, maybe even respect. It was the first time all day that someone had looked at him like he might actually belong in this hangar. What's going on, George? Sterling asked. The new intern thinks he might have spotted something we missed, George replied, already removing the panel Devin had pointed out. Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly. The intern? George connected his test equipment to the power sequencer relay. The readings on his meter made him frown, then check his connections, then frown again. Well, I'll be damned, he said finally. Kid's right. This relay is operating outside normal parameters. It's not completely failed, which is why it passed the basic tests, but it's definitely not handling load surges properly. The mood in the hangar shifted. Suddenly, Devin wasn't just the new kid anymore. He was the person who'd solved a problem that had stumped mechanics with decades of experience. Sterling walked over to Devin. What's your name, son? Devin Parker, sir. Well, Devin Parker, looks like you just saved me a very expensive delay. Sterling extended his hand and Devin shook it, trying not to show how nervous he was. Where did you learn about power sequencer relays? My grandfather's aviation. Devin hesitated for a moment, then pulled the chain from under his shirt. The small gold wings caught the hangar's fluorescent lights gleaming despite their age. They were clearly vintage with intricate details that modern jewelry didn't have. A small serial number was etched into the back, barely visible unless you knew where to look. "They're pilot wings," Devin said, holding them carefully. "My grandfather earned them in the Air Force back in the day. He always wore them, even after he stopped flying commercially. My grandmother gave them to me when he passed." Sterling's face had gone completely white. His hands were actually shaking as he stared at the wings. Several mechanics had gathered around to see what was happening, but Sterling seemed to have forgotten they existed. "Those wings?" Sterling started, then stopped. He blinked several times like he was trying to focus. "They're beautiful. Very detailed craftsmanship." "Thank you, sir," Devin said, tucking them back under his shirt. He could tell something was bothering Sterling, but he had no idea what. George cleared his throat. "Sir, should we go ahead and replace that relay? We can have the aircraft ready in about 2 hours." Sterling seemed to snap back to the present. Yes, of course. Do whatever needs to be done." But his eyes kept drifting back to Devin. As George and the other mechanics began the repair work, Devin found himself watching the process with intense interest. The power sequencer relay was a small component, no bigger than a deck of cards, but removing it required disconnecting dozens of wires and carefully labeling each one. "Hand me that wire stripper," George called out. Devin grabbed the tool and passed it over. As he did, he noticed something that made him pause. "Mr. George, are you planning to use the same gauge wire for the replacement connections?" George looked up from his work. "What do you mean?" "Well, looking at the wiring diagram, this aircraft was manufactured in 2018, but that relay looks like it was installed more recently. The wire gauge on some of these connections looks different from the original specifications." Tony rolled his eyes. "Here we go again. Kid thinks he knows better than the factory." But George was actually listening. He pulled out a wire gauge tool and checked the connections Devin was pointing out. His expression grew serious. "You're right," George said slowly. "These 3 connections are 14 gauge wire, but the manual calls for 12 gauge on this circuit. 14 gauge has higher resistance." "That would explain why the relay was overheating," Devin continued, his confidence growing. "The higher resistance would cause voltage drops under load, making the relay work harder than it was designed to. Eventually, it would start to fail intermittently." Sterling, who had been pretending to check his phone, was now listening intently to every word. "So whoever installed this relay used the wrong wire?" asked another mechanic. Devin studied the installation more carefully. "Actually, I think someone made a field repair at some point. See how these 3 wires are a slightly different color, and the way they're routed is different from the others. Someone probably had to replace damaged wiring, maybe after a lightning strike or electrical surge, and they used whatever wire they had available." George was nodding now. "That makes sense. If the aircraft took a lightning hit, the insurance company would want it repaired as quickly as possible. The repair shop might have used substitute parts to get it flying again. But they should have upgraded to the correct specifications later," Devin said. "The substitute wire was probably meant to be temporary." Sterling stepped closer to the group. "How do you know all this?" he asked Devin directly. "This is pretty advanced electrical theory." Devin felt heat rise in his cheeks. "My grandfather used to quiz me on aircraft systems when I was younger. He said understanding the basics would help me understand everything else. He had boxes of old technical manuals, and I used to read them like comic books." "What kind of aircraft did your grandfather fly?" Sterling's voice was carefully controlled, but Devin caught an intensity there that hadn't been present before. "All kinds, sir. Military transports in the Air Force, then commercial jets when he got out. Boeing 727, 737, some of the older models. He used to tell me stories about flying in bad weather, dealing with equipment failures, that sort of thing." Sterling was quiet for a long moment. "Sounds like he was a good pilot." "The best," Devin said with pride. He always said that good pilots don't just know how to fly the plane when everything's working. They know how to fix it when things go wrong. As the mechanics continued their work, Devin found himself naturally falling into a supportive role. When George needed a specific tool, Devin seemed to know exactly which one to hand him. When they needed to reference the wiring diagram, Devin pointed out the relevant sections before anyone asked. "You've got good instincts, kid," George said during a quiet moment. "Better than some guys I've worked with for years. My grandfather always said that aircraft want to fly. If something's preventing that, It's usually trying to tell you what's wrong. You just have to know how to listen. Smart man, said a voice behind them. Sterling had been standing there listening. It sounds like he understood that aircraft are more than just machines. Yes, sir. He used to say they each had their own personality. Like this Gulfstream, it's trying to tell us that something isn't quite right with its electrical system. The intermittent failures weren't random. They were a pattern. Sterling's eyes were fixed on Devon's face. You really believe that? That aircraft communicate with their pilots and mechanics? In a way, yes, sir. Not with words, obviously, but through vibrations, sounds, how the controls feel, even how the electrical systems behave. My grandfather taught me that if you pay attention, an aircraft will tell you exactly what it needs. The conversation was interrupted by George's voice. All right, we've got the new relay installed with the correct wire gauge. Let's run a systems check. For the next hour, they methodically tested every electrical system on the aircraft. Devon watched as lights came on, instruments powered up, and various components cycled through their operations. Everything functioned perfectly. Looking good, George announced. All systems are operating within normal parameters. Sterling nodded with satisfaction. Excellent work, everyone. He paused, then looked directly at Devon. Especially you, son. That was impressive problem solving. Thank you, sir. I was just applying what my grandfather taught me. Your grandfather sounds like he was an exceptional pilot, Sterling said quietly. I'd like to hear more about him sometime. Something in Sterling's tone made Devon look at him more carefully. There was an emotion there that he couldn't identify, almost like sadness but mixed with something else. He would have liked meeting you, sir, Devon said. He always respected people who cared about aviation safety. Sterling's hand moved unconsciously toward his chest, and Devon noticed for the first time that the CEO was wearing a small pin on his suit lapel. It looked like wings too, but different from his grandfather's. More modern. That's a nice pin, sir, Devon said, pointing to Sterling's lapel. Sterling looked down, seemingly surprised to remember he was wearing it. It's from an airline. Someone special gave it to me a long time ago. An airline pilot. Yes, Sterling said softly. Someone who made a big difference in my life. The way Sterling said it made Devon curious. But before he could ask any questions, Rick approached with a clipboard. Devon, I need you to help Tony with some inventory work. Mr. Sterling, your aircraft is ready for its test flight whenever you are. As the group began to disperse, Sterling lingered near Devon. You know, he said quietly, your grandfather's wings. They're very distinctive. That particular design with those serial numbers, they're quite rare. Devon's hand went automatically to his chest, touching the wings through his shirt. Really? I never knew that. Yes, Sterling said, his voice strange. Very rare indeed. I've only seen one other pair exactly like them. Before Devon could ask what he meant, Sterling turned and walked toward his aircraft, leaving Devon standing there with more questions than answers. But as he watched the CEO go, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Sterling was walking differently now. His shoulders were tense, and he kept looking back at Devon like he was seeing a ghost. There was definitely something Sterling wasn't telling him about those wings. 2 hours later, Devon was helping Tony organize parts in the supply room when he heard his name called over the hangar's intercom system. Devon Parker to the main floor. Devon Parker to the main floor. Tony looked up from the inventory sheet he was checking. Wonder what that's about. You probably did something wrong. But when Devon walked back into the main hangar, he found Sterling standing near his Gulfstream with George and several other mechanics. The CEO had changed out of his expensive suit into khaki pants and a polo shirt, like he was planning to stay for a while. There you are, Sterling said when he spotted Devon. I wanted to thank you personally before I left. That relay issue could have caused a serious problem if it hadn't been caught. Just doing my job, sir, Devon replied, though inside he felt proud that he'd made such a difference on his first day. Sterling nodded, but he seemed distracted. His eyes kept drifting to Devon's chest, where the chain of his necklace was barely visible under his work shirt. Devon, Sterling said suddenly, would you mind if I took another look at those wings you're wearing? I'm something of a collector of aviation memorabilia, and I'm curious about the craftsmanship. Devon hesitated. The wings were precious to him, and he didn't usually take them off. But Sterling was the boss, and he'd been nothing but kind all day. Sure, sir, Devon said, carefully pulling the chain over his head. He handed the wings to Sterling, watching as the older man's hands trembled slightly when he took them. Sterling held the wings up to the light, examining them closely. Devon could see him reading the small serial number etched into the back. As Sterling read, his face went from pale to almost gray. His breathing became shallow and quick. Sterling's voice cracked and he had to clear his throat and start again.
Where exactly did you say your grandfather served?
All over, sir. But he did a lot of flying out of Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. And later he flew commercial routes mostly on the East Coast. Sterling's hands were shaking harder now. What was his full name again? Captain James Jimmy Williams. Everyone called him Jimmy. He was really proud of his service record. The wings slipped from Sterling's fingers and would have hit the concrete floor if Devon hadn't caught them quickly. Sterling staggered backward and sat down heavily on a nearby tool cart. "Sir, are you okay?" Devon asked, genuinely concerned. "Should I call someone?" Sterling waved him off, but his face was white and his hands were pressed against his chest like he was having trouble breathing. "Flight 847, Sterling whispered, so quietly that Devon almost missed it. "What did you say, sir?" Sterling looked up at Devon with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far away. "Tell me about your grandfather's commercial flying career. What airline did he work for?" "Transatlantic Airways, sir. He flew their East Coast routes for almost 15 years. "Why do you ask?" Sterling closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. When he opened them again, tears were visible. "August 15, 1997, Sterling said slowly. "Do you know what happened to your grandfather on that date?" Devon frowned. "That was before I was born, sir. But I think that was around the time he had to stop flying. He had some kind of medical emergency. A heart attack," Sterling said quietly. "He had a heart attack after making an emergency landing that saved the lives of everyone on board his aircraft." Devon's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" Sterling stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. "Because I was on that plane." The hangar seemed to go completely quiet. Even the mechanics working on other aircraft seemed to sense that something important was happening. "You were, what?" Devon stammered. "Flight 847, Transatlantic Airways, Boston to Miami, August 15, 1997. I was 26 years old, just starting my first company. I was flying to Miami for a business meeting that I thought would change my life." Sterling walked over to Devon, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "We were about an hour out of Boston when we hit the worst thunderstorm I've ever experienced. Lightning was hitting the plane. The engines were making terrible noises, and then we lost power to half the aircraft." Devon found himself holding his breath. The captain came on the intercom. Sterling continued, his voice growing stronger as he remembered. "He said we were going to make an emergency landing at a small airport in Virginia." His voice was so calm, so confident. "He told us exactly what was going to happen and what we needed to do." Sterling's eyes were distant now, lost in the memory. "For 45 minutes, that pilot fought to keep us in the air. The co-pilot later told us that most of the flight controls weren't working properly. The engines were failing. But somehow your grandfather brought that plane down safely." Devon felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. "My grandfather saved your life?" "Not just mine. There were 247 people on that plane. Men, women, children, babies. Your grandfather saved every single one of us." Sterling reached out and gently took the wings from Devon's hands again, cradling them like they were made of glass. "I remember seeing him after we landed. He was standing outside the aircraft, making sure every passenger got off safely. Even though he was clearly in pain, even though he was having chest pains, he wouldn't leave until he knew everyone was okay." Tears were running down Sterling's cheeks now. Then he collapsed. Right there on the tarmac. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack brought on by the stress of the emergency landing. They rushed him to the hospital and I tried to follow, but everything was chaos. Devon felt his own eyes beginning to water. He never told us much about that day, just that he had to retire because of his heart. The doctors said the heart attack damaged his heart too severely for him to ever fly commercially again. His career was over, but he'd saved all those lives. Sterling held up the wings, and Devon could see how the serial number matched something Sterling seemed to recognize. "I tried to find him after I got out of the hospital. I wanted to thank him, to help him somehow. I had just started making money with my first tech company, and I wanted to make sure he and his family were taken care of." "What happened?" "I searched for months, but Captain Williams had moved away from the area. Different address, different phone number. I hired private investigators, but they couldn't track him down. It was like he'd disappeared. Sterling's voice broke slightly. Years later, when my company really took off and I had real money, I tried again. That's when I learned he had passed away. The investigator found his obituary from Detroit. It mentioned that he was survived by a daughter and a grandson. Sterling looked directly into Devon's eyes. I've carried the guilt of never being able to thank him for 28 years. I owed that man my life, and I never got the chance to tell him. Devon was struggling to process everything he was hearing. His quiet, humble grandfather, who had told him bedtime stories and taught him about airplanes, had been a hero. Had literally saved hundreds of lives. He never told us, Devon said quietly. He never said he was a hero. That's exactly what a real hero would do, Sterling replied. Your grandfather didn't save those lives for recognition or reward. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Sterling carefully placed the chain back around Devon's neck, his hands gentle and reverent. These wings, he said softly, represent more courage and skill than most people show in a lifetime. Devon looked down at the wings resting against his chest. They felt heavier now, weighted with a history he'd never known. Sir, Devon said quietly, my grandfather would have been honored to know that you remembered him. Sterling's smile was sad but genuine. I never forgot him, son. Not for a single day. Sterling sat down on the tool cart again, his face still pale from the shock of recognition. The mechanics had given them some space, but Devon could see them watching curiously from across the hangar. Would you like to hear the whole story? Sterling asked quietly. About what really happened that day? Devon nodded, settling down on another cart facing Sterling. Something told him this was going to be important. Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, then began speaking in a voice that seemed to come from far away. August 15th, 1997. I was flying from Boston to Miami for what I thought was the most important business meeting of my life. I had developed some software that I believed could change everything, and a major company wanted to hear my pitch. Sterling's hands moved as he talked, like he was trying to paint the memory in the air. I was so nervous about the meeting that I'd barely slept in 3 days. I remember boarding the plane and thinking that this flight would either make me rich or prove that I was just another failed entrepreneur. Devon found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story. The flight started normally. Beautiful clear weather, smooth takeoff. I was reviewing my presentation notes, trying to calm my nerves. About an hour into the flight, I noticed some passengers looking out the windows and pointing. Sterling's voice grew quieter. Dark clouds were building ahead of us. Really dark. The kind that looked like mountains made of black cotton. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom. He said we might experience some turbulence and to keep our seatbelts fastened. Your grandfather had such a calm voice. Even when he was telling us about the storm, he sounded like he was discussing the weather over coffee. It made everyone feel safer. Devon tried to imagine his grandfather's voice filling an airplane cabin, reassuring scared passengers. But then things got bad fast, Sterling continued. The turbulence started gentle, just little bumps. Then it got stronger. People started looking worried. Drinks were spilling, overhead bins were rattling. Sterling paused, his hands gripping the edge of the tool cart. Then we hit the real storm. It felt like the plane was being shaken by a giant. Lightning was flashing so bright outside that it lit up the whole cabin. The engines started making noises I'd never heard before. What kind of noises? Devon asked. Grinding sounds. Popping sounds. Like something was breaking apart. Then the lights in the cabin started flickering. Some of the passengers were crying. A few were praying out loud. Sterling's eyes were distant now, completely lost in the memory. That's when your grandfather's voice came back on the intercom. But this time was different. He explained that we were experiencing some mechanical difficulties due to lightning strikes. He said we were going to land at a small airport in Virginia instead of continuing to Miami. How did he sound when he said that? Still calm. Still in control. But you could hear something else in his voice. Now, focus, like he was thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Sterling stood up and began pacing, slowly. What we didn't know at the time was how bad things really were. I found out later that the lightning had damaged 2 of the engines and most of the electrical systems. The co-pilot told me afterward that they had lost communication with air traffic control. The navigation systems were failing. Devon felt a chill run down his spine. For the next 45 minutes, your grandfather flew that plane mostly by feel. The backup instruments were working, but barely. He had to judge wind speed by looking at trees and lakes on the ground. He had to find that small airport without any electronic help. Sterling stopped pacing and looked directly at Devon. Do you know what the hardest part was for him? It wasn't flying the damaged plane. It was keeping all of us calm while he did it. What do you mean? Every 10 minutes he would come back on the intercom. He would tell us exactly what was happening, what he was doing to fix it, and what we should expect next. He never lied to us, but he never made us panic either. Sterling's voice was filled with admiration. I remember one announcement in particular. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be landing in about 20 minutes. The approach might feel a little different than usual, but I want you to know that I've been flying for 22 years, and I've never failed to get my passengers safely to the ground." Devon felt tears forming in his eyes as he imagined his grandfather speaking those words. When we started the final approach, you could feel that something was wrong with the plane. It was shaking more than it should. The engines sounded like they were struggling, but your grandfather brought us down like he was landing a feather. Sterling's voice cracked slightly. The landing itself was the smoothest I've ever experienced. You wouldn't have known anything was wrong if you hadn't seen the emergency vehicles waiting for us on the runway. Emergency vehicles? Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. The airport had been cleared of all other traffic, but your grandfather had radioed ahead and told them exactly where he was going to touch down, and that's exactly where he put the plane. Sterling sat back down, his legs seeming unsteady. When the plane stopped, everyone just sat there for a moment in complete silence. Then someone started clapping. Within seconds, the entire cabin was applauding. People were crying and hugging strangers. What happened next? Your grandfather opened the cockpit door and walked back through the cabin. He was still wearing his captain's hat, still had that calm expression on his face. He stopped at every row and asked if everyone was okay. He helped elderly passengers with their bags. He even carried a baby for a young mother. Sterling wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I was sitting in the back of the plane, and he was one of the last people I saw before getting off. I thanked him, and he just smiled and said, "That's what we're here for, son." "Glad you're safe." "He called you son?" "Yeah, he did. Just like I'm calling you son now." Sterling looked at Devon with wonder in his eyes. "I can see so much of him in you. The way you think about problems, the way you explain things to people. It's like he's still here." Sterling's expression grew darker. "I watched from the terminal window as your grandfather did a final inspection of the aircraft. He was walking around the outside checking for damage, making notes on a clipboard. That's when I saw him grab his chest and fall to his knees." Devon's hands clenched into fists. The stress of flying that damaged plane for 45 minutes had pushed his heart beyond its limits. The paramedics were there in seconds, but the damage was done. I tried to follow the ambulance to the hospital, but the airport was in chaos. Nobody could tell me which hospital they'd taken him to. Sterling stood up again, agitation clear in his movements. "I spent 3 days in Virginia, going to every hospital trying to find him. Finally, a nurse at the 3rd hospital told me that Captain Williams was in intensive care, but that only family members were allowed to visit." "Did you try to contact him later?" "I tried everything. I called Transatlantic Airways, but they said they couldn't give out personal information about employees. I hired a private investigator 6 months later, when my business started making money. But by then your grandfather had retired and moved away from the area." Sterling's face was filled with regret. The investigator found an old address in Maryland, but the people living there said the Williams family had moved to Detroit. We tried the Detroit address, but it was a rental property, and the landlord said they'd moved again. "He was trying to find work," Devon said quietly. "After his heart attack, he couldn't fly anymore. My grandmother told me they moved around a lot for a few years while he figured out what to do next. By the time I had real money, enough to really help him, it was 2003. That's when the investigator found his obituary." Sterling's voice broke completely. "Lung cancer. He'd been gone for 2 years and I never even knew." The obituary mentioned that he was survived by his wife, a daughter named Carol, and a grandson. It said the family requested donations to a scholarship fund for aviation students instead of flowers. Devon felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You tried to find us after he died?" "I did find you, actually. Your grandmother was still living in Detroit then. But when my investigator approached her, she thought it was some kind of scam. A billionaire claiming her husband had saved his life? She refused to meet with anyone." Sterling laughed bitterly. "I don't blame her. It probably did sound like a scam, but I kept having the investigator check on your family from a distance. I knew your grandmother was struggling financially. I knew your mother was working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. I knew you were a smart kid who loved airplanes. Devin stared at Sterling in shock. You've been watching our family for years? Not watching, just checking, making sure you were okay. I set up a scholarship fund at your technical school, though I never told them who it was for. I made anonymous donations to the aviation program. I've been trying to help without interfering. Sterling's eyes filled with tears again, but I always hoped that someday, somehow, I'd get the chance to tell your family what your grandfather meant to me, what he did for all those people on that plane. Devin looked down at the wings resting against his chest, then back up at Sterling. He would have been amazed to know that you became so successful. I became successful because I lived, Sterling said firmly, and I lived because of your grandfather's skill and courage. For several minutes, Sterling and Devin sat in silence, both lost in their thoughts. The hangar around them had grown quieter as the afternoon shift wound down, but neither of them seemed to notice. Finally, Sterling stood up and looked around at the mechanics who were still working nearby. His voice, when he spoke, was stronger than it had been all day. George, could you gather everyone around for a moment? I have something I'd like to share. George looked puzzled but called out to the other mechanics. Hey everyone, Mr. Sterling wants to talk to us. Within a few minutes, about 15 people had gathered around them. Tony was there, along with Rick and several other mechanics Devin had met during the day. They all looked curious about what was happening. Sterling cleared his throat and looked around the group. I want to tell you all about something that happened 28 years ago, something that changed my life forever. The mechanics exchanged glances but stayed quiet. In 1997, I was on a commercial flight that ran into serious trouble. Lightning strikes, engine failures, electrical problems. The kind of emergency that usually doesn't end well. Sterling's voice carried clearly through the hangar. But our pilot, Captain James Williams, managed to save every single person on that plane, all 247 of us. He flew a damaged aircraft for 45 minutes and brought us down safely, even though it cost him his career and nearly cost him his life. Devin felt every eye in the group shift to him. Today, I met Captain Williams' grandson, Sterling continued, placing a hand on Devin's shoulder. The young man who solved our avionics problem this morning is the grandson of the pilot who saved my life. The silence in the hangar was complete now. Devin is wearing his grandfather's pilot wings, Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. The same wings that Captain Williams earned through years of service to this country and to aviation safety. George was the first to speak. Mr. Sterling, are you saying that Devin's grandfather was a real hero? I'm saying that Devin's grandfather was the kind of hero who never called himself one, Sterling replied. The kind who did the right thing because it was right, not because anyone was watching. Sterling turned to face Devin directly. Son, I owe your grandfather a debt that I can never fully repay. But I'd like to try if you'll let me. Devin felt his heart racing. Sir, you don't owe us anything. I owe you everything, Sterling said firmly. And I have a proposition for you. Sterling walked over to a nearby workbench and leaned against it, addressing both Devin and the group of mechanics. I've been thinking about expanding my business into aerospace manufacturing, not just maintaining aircraft but building them, creating new technologies that make flying safer and more efficient. The mechanics were listening intently now. But to do that, I need people who understand aircraft the way your grandfather did. People who can think beyond just following procedures. People who can solve problems that haven't been solved before. Sterling looked directly at Devin. I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to any aviation program in the country. Embry-Riddle, MIT, wherever you want to go. Full tuition, books, living expenses, everything. Devin's mouth fell open. Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say. There's more, Sterling continued. When you graduate, I want you to come work for me. I'm starting a new division called Sterling Aerospace, and I want you to help me build it from the ground up. Tony stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, Devin's just a kid. He's been here one day. Sterling smiled. Tony, this kid solved a problem in 4 hours that stumped a team of experienced mechanics. But more than that, he thinks about aircraft the way his grandfather did, like they're living things that need to be understood, not just fixed. Sterling turned back to Devin. I want to help you become the pilot your grandfather would have been proud of. I want to give you opportunities to use your talents in ways that honor his memory. Devin's eyes filled with tears.
Sir, this is incredible.
But it's too much. I couldn't accept something like this. Yes, you can, Sterling said gently. Because it's not charity. It's an investment. In you, in aviation, and in making sure your grandfather's legacy lives on. Sterling paused, then continued with growing excitement. In fact, I want to do more than just help you. I want to help other young people who have the same passion for aviation that you do. He looked around at the assembled mechanics. I'm going to establish the Captain James Williams Aviation Academy, a place where kids from any background can learn about aircraft, get proper training, and pursue careers in aviation. The mechanics began murmuring among themselves, clearly impressed by what they were hearing. The academy will offer scholarships, internships, and direct pathways into jobs with Sterling Aerospace. We'll focus on kids who might not otherwise have opportunities in aviation. Sterling's voice grew stronger as he spoke. And the first thing we're going to do is create a hall of honor, where we'll display the stories of aviation heroes like Captain Williams, people who made sacrifices to keep others safe. Sterling looked at Devon's chest, where the pilot wings were visible under his shirt. Devon, would you consider allowing us to display a replica of your grandfather's wings in that hall, along with the story of Flight 847 and what he did that day? Devon's hand went automatically to his chest. You want to honor my grandfather? I want to make sure that every young person who walks through that academy knows what real heroism looks like. I want them to understand that being a pilot isn't just about flying planes. It's about protecting the people who trust you with their lives. George stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, this sounds like an amazing project. How can we help? Sterling smiled broadly. George, I was hoping you'd ask. I want Premier Aviation Services to be the official training partner for the academy. Real aircraft, real problems, real experience for the students. He gestured around the hangar. This place will become a classroom where young people can learn the same way Devon learned today, by working on actual aircraft, solving real problems, and learning from experienced professionals like all of you. Rick raised his hand. What about Devon? When does he start this scholarship program? Sterling looked at Devon. That's up to him. We could have him enrolled in a flight training program by next month if he wants, or he could finish his technical school program first. Whatever feels right. Devon felt overwhelmed by the possibilities. Mr. Sterling, I need to talk to my mother and grandmother about this. Of course, but I hope you'll say yes, because I believe your grandfather would want you to fly. Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. This has my personal number on it. Call me when you've made your decision. As Devon took the card, Sterling continued. But I want you to know something, son. Whether you accept my offer or not, you've already honored your grandfather's memory. The way you solved that problem today, the way you think about aircraft, the way you carry yourself, that's his legacy living on. Devon looked down at the wings hanging around his neck, then back up at Sterling. He always told me that good things happen to people who work hard and help others. Sounds like he was right, Sterling said with a smile. As the group began to disperse, Sterling pulled Devon aside for one more private conversation. There's something else I want you to think about, he said quietly. Your grandfather saved 247 lives that day. Some of those people went on to become doctors, teachers, engineers, parents. They've touched thousands of other lives because they survived. Sterling's eyes were bright with possibility. Imagine what you could accomplish with the right training and opportunities. Imagine how many lives you could impact through the aircraft you design, the safety systems you develop, or the pilots you train. Devon felt a shiver of excitement run through him. The academy we're going to build won't just be about honoring the past, Sterling continued. It'll be about creating the future. And I believe your grandfather would want you to be part of that future. As Sterling walked toward his aircraft for the flight home, Devon remained standing in the hangar, holding the business card and feeling the weight of his grandfather's wings against his chest. For the first time in his life, he could see a path forward that felt bigger than anything he'd ever imagined, a path that would let him honor his grandfather's memory while building something meaningful for the future. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. Mom, he said when she answered, you're not going to believe what happened today, but I think Grandpa Jimmy would be really proud. 6 months later, Devon was enrolled in flight school, and construction had begun on the Captain James Williams Aviation Academy. The first class of students would include 20 young people from backgrounds just like Devon's, all of them carrying the legacy of courage and excellence that his grandfather had embodied. And in the Academy's Hall of Honor, A perfect replica of Captain Williams's pilot wings would remind every student that true heroes fly not for glory, but for the people counting on them to bring them safely home.